Just as we were getting into my car to start on a trip to central Mexico on October 5th, 1968, Don Juan stopped me. "I have told you before," he said with a serious expression, "that one should never reveal the name nor the whereabouts of a sorcerer. I believe you understood that you should never reveal my name nor the place where my body is. Now I'm going to ask you to do the same with a friend of mine, a friend you will call Genaro. We are going to his house. We'll spend some time there." I assured Don Juan that I had never betrayed his confidence. "I know that," he said without changing his serious expression. "Yet I'm concerned with your becoming thoughtless." I protested, and Don Juan said his aim was only to remind me that every time one was careless in matters of sorcery, one was playing with an imminent and senseless death that could be averted by being thoughtful and aware. "We will not touch upon this matter any longer," he said. "Once we leave my house, we will not mention Genaro, nor will we think about him. I want you to put your thoughts in order now. When you meet him, you must be clear and have no doubts in your mind." "What kind of doubts are you referring to, Don Juan?" "Any kind of doubts whatever. When you meet him, you ought to be crystal clear. He will see you." His strange admonitions made me very apprehensive. I mentioned that perhaps I should not meet his friend at all, but only drive to the vicinity of his friend's house and leave him there. "What I've told you was only a precaution," he said. "You've met one sorcerer already, Vicente, and he nearly killed you. Watch out this time." After we arrived in central Mexico, it took us 2 days to walk from where I left my car to his friend's house, a little shack perched on the side of a mountain. Don Juan's friend was at the door as if he had been waiting for us. "You're welcome to my humble little shack," he said apologetically in Spanish. His words were a polite formula I had heard before in various rural areas of Mexico. Yet as he said the words, he laughed joyously for no overt reason, and I knew he was exercising his controlled folly. He did not care in the least that his house was a shack. I liked Don Genaro very much. For the next 2 days we went into the mountains to collect plants. Don Juan, Don Genaro, and I left each day at the crack of dawn. We returned to the house in the late afternoon, and both days I was so tired that I fell asleep immediately. The third day, however, was different. The three of us worked together, and Don Juan asked Don Genaro to teach me how to select certain plants. We returned around noon, and the old men sat for hours in front of the house in complete silence, as if they were in a state of trance. "You must talk to the plants before you pick them," Don Juan said. He dropped his words casually and repeated his statement 3 times, as if to catch my attention. Nobody had said a word until he spoke. It was late in the afternoon. Don Juan was sitting on a flat rock facing the western mountains. Don Genaro was sitting by him on a straw mat with his face toward the north. Don Juan had told me the first day we were there that those were their positions, and that I had to sit on the ground at any place opposite to both of them. Don Genaro was staring at me. I was taking notes, and that seemed to baffle him. He smiled at me, shook his head, and said something to Don Juan. Don Juan shrugged his shoulders. I glanced at Don Genaro and saw him performing a most unusual act. He was standing on his head without the aid of his arms or hands, and his legs were crossed as if he were sitting. The sight was so incongruous that it made me jump. When I realized he was doing something almost impossible from the point of view of body mechanics, he had gone back again to a normal sitting position. Don Juan, however, seemed to be cognizant of what was involved and celebrated Don Genaro's performance with roaring laughter. Don Genaro seemed to have noticed my confusion. He clapped his hands a couple of times and rolled on the ground again. Apparently, he wanted me to watch him. What had at first appeared to be rolling on the ground was actually leaning over in a sitting position and touching the ground with his head. He seemingly attained his illogical posture by gaining momentum, leaning over several times until the inertia carried his body to a vertical stand, so that for an instant he sat on his head. The two of them had another moment of mirth. Then Don Juan became serious again and said that if I did not think of my death, my entire life would be only a personal chaos. He looked very stern. "What else can a man have except his life and his death?" he said to me. At that point I felt it was indispensable to take notes, and I began writing again. Don Genaro stared at me and smiled. Then he tilted his head back a little and opened his nostrils. He apparently had remarkable control over the muscles operating his nostrils, because they opened up to perhaps twice their normal size. What was most comical about his clowning was not so much his gestures as his own reactions to them. After he enlarged his nostrils, he tumbled down, laughing, and worked his body again into the same strange sitting-on-his-head upside-down posture. Don Juan laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. I felt a bit embarrassed and laughed nervously. Don Juan looked at me still laughing and said that his friend was portraying me, that my tendency was to open my nostrils whenever I wrote, and that Don Genaro thought that trying to become a sorcerer by taking notes was as absurd as sitting on one's head, and thus he had made up the ludicrous posture of resting the weight of his sitting body on his head. "Perhaps you don't think it's funny," Don Juan said, "but only Genaro can work his way up to sitting on his head, and only you can think of learning to be a sorcerer by writing your way up." They both had another explosion of laughter, and Don Genaro repeated his incredible movement. I liked him. There was so much grace and directness in his acts. "Which direction is the wind?" Don Genaro asked casually. Don Juan pointed to the west with a movement of his head. "I'd better go where the wind blows," Don Genaro said with a serious expression. He then turned and shook his finger at me. "And don't you pay any attention if you hear strange noises," he said. "When Genaro shits, the mountains tremble." He leaped into the bushes, and a moment later I heard a very strange noise, a deep, unearthly rumble. I did not know what to make of it. I looked at Don Juan for a clue, but he was doubled over with laughter.